Okay, and we are recording. Excellent. Okay, so as I said, I'm really excited about the paper. As always, I'm really glad you guys are doing this, and I think it's definitely going to be an important paper because, in terms of your personal professional development, the idea of kind of pushing forward the literature on group perceptions, it's definitely going to be like a step forward. Some normal science is little baby steps, but this is a big step because social psychologists, so often, historically, not so much lately, but historically, have been rooted in the lab and think simply about phenomena like this. And so, kind of to vastly oversimplify, in the old days, it was the false consensus effect, the idea being that we as individuals project our own opinion onto a group, no matter what the group is. Who cares? It's just we do that. And then sort of the second phase is, the Judd Leaf stuff that says, well, no, actually, if you're not a part of the group, then you might have an incentive to project the opposite onto the group. And now you're saying, yeah, but wait a second, there's different kinds of groups. There are groups where if I ask you, what do the owners of pizza stores think about abortion? That, yes, that's a group that's well defined. We could figure out who's in that group and who's not in that group. And then a perceiver could certainly try to make a guess about that group, maybe by saying, well, kind of what are the characteristics of pizza owners and how might they correlate? What are the correlates of abortion opinions in general? And then try to, and maybe mix in a little bit of their own personal position in a projection way and come up with some perception. But the thing that's you're pointing out, which in some ways, once you point it out, it's obvious, but before you pointed it out, it's really, as far as I can tell, it's not in that literature, is that there are some groups that have these exemplars or spokespeople who are informative and visible, and that this is especially obvious in the political domain. But it's true in other domains too, that, when the president of the American Medical Association speaks about medicine, there's reason to imagine that person's opinions, that they express anyway, might correspond with the opinions of the membership of the organization for kind of a bidirectional causality reason, which is, number one, that that person was chosen to play that role. And so it could be that the process of choosing leads to picking people who share whose opinions and what they say will be popular among the membership, because otherwise they wouldn't be chosen. But secondly, because a person in that position has what they sometimes call a bully pulpit, the potential to persuade the membership of the organization to adopt a particular opinion. And obviously, when doctors are all of a sudden confronted with Obamacare for the first time, they didn't know it didn't exist before, they didn't have an opinion about it before, but now that they hear about it, the leadership of their organization can help persuade them to think a particular way about it. So it kind of, for your purposes, it doesn't matter which direction the causality goes in, that it could be that the organization picks people who have views in line with the membership, or it could be that the leadership persuades the membership to adopt particular opinions. Either way, no matter what kind of what we'll call lay theories people have about the linkage between the opinions either held by or expressed by, and that may be a distinction, right? It may be that kind of doesn't matter what the American Medical Association president privately believes. What may matter is just what he or she says publicly. That there'll be some constraints that will potentially make that person's utterances informative about the membership. And so given that foundation, and just saying it that way establishes a kind of interesting potential for moderation, just to keep in the back of our minds. In other words, perceivers may have lay theories about the leaders of some groups being representative of the membership and persuasive of the membership and and chosen by the membership on these grounds. And then other ones, that like the guy who's the president of the local tennis league, there's no reason to think that the fact that he was chosen to lead the local tennis league, if you say, what do the Palo Alto Tennis League member players think about abortion, there's no linkage of the nature of the group to this issue. And so what anybody perceives to be the position on abortion of the tennis league manager is irrelevant. It's uninformative. And so that in that sense, it may be, even in a paper like this, where you're not going to test that moderation hypothesis, that it may be advantageous from a kind of theory building perspective just to kind of note that's one of the foundations here, that the process you're talking about kind of only works if the perceivers are building on a lay theory that there is some linkage between the opinions expressed by the group exemplars or spokespeople on the one hand, and the opinions of the rank and file membership of the group on the other hand. Okay, so having said that, once people hold that kind of necessary conditioned background belief about the group, which obviously is going to hold for the Democratic and Republican parties, then when people are asked to assess the opinion the opinions of members of the group, reasonable data points to take into consideration are any information that one has about the opinions of other members of the group, individual members of the group, and oneself, but especially the positions of the exemplars or the spokespeople. So that's great. That's a sensible foundation for the theory that you're building. And then the idea being that people may use the exemplars in one of two ways, either just in this additive way, where you say, well, okay, I got some information about what Democrats think. First of all, I know a bunch of Democrats, I know what they think. I'm a Democrat, I know what I think. And then I know what the Democratic leaders think. And so I'm just going to kind of add these all up. It's going to be like a weighted average, where I'm going to say, there's my position, there's Newt Gingrich's position, there's Ronald Reagan's position, et cetera. And you could even write an equation and say, this is one possible scenario. That's the additive weighted scenario. And people, need to make some decision about what weights to put on each of the individual considerations. And you're not really needing to take a position on how big the weights are going to be. But that Robin Dawes paper that I might have mentioned to you before, do you remember that one? Are you citing that now?
Yeah. I don't think we've added it in yet, but maybe this could be a place to do that.
Yeah, so he's just basically saying, this is a data point. Making people look claiming that people look foolish because they're using themselves is not fair, because it is a data point. That's just his point. And so you could just cite that, and sort of say this is the additive model. On the other hand, you could say that perhaps people realize that as an individual data point, they don't really count for much. Whereas if you hear the leader of the Republican Party say, climate change is a hoax, that may be much more informative. That it may be that in this situation, that deserves more weight. And in fact, it might deserve so much weight that it might lead you to say, you know what, I'm not a data point. I mean, I'm really out of this. I am not a person who is representative of this group, and so I really shouldn't add myself in at all. And so therefore, that then posits an interaction, and you could literally, in the introduction, you could have another equation that has the interaction in it, where you say quite explicitly that you are entertaining the possibility that under circumstances where the perceiver is out of line with the express positions of the spokespeople and the exemplars, that then leads the weight placed on one's own opinion to go to zero. So I'm just kind of answering the question that I think you said, that it would help to clarify a little bit more the distinction between the additive and interactive models.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I think, like, hearing it described like that, it helps me to kind of get a sense of, like, what the, like, kind of psychology of the opinion deviant would be in that case. So it's helpful to think, like, yes, there's so much weight that I'm no longer a data point. I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah, and it's more than just so much weight. I mean, it could be, the so much weight thing could be, it's an additive thing where you just put them together. But in fact, the argument here is to say that it's not that the weight of the exemplars gets huge, but it's rather that the weight of the own position goes to zero. Mm-hmm. And that's a slightly different thing. And so I think, this is the kind of theory building that psychologists are going to be excited about. And, where you're saying, wow, they're going to say, this is a new way of thinking about this. That's cool. Because it really isn't out there at all. And so, approaching it in that way, where you're highlighting this new perspective, obviously now sets up a challenge, because the fact of the matter is, when you're studying Republicans and Democrats and climate change, the positions of the exemplars is not, number one, it's not a variable. It's not a variable that you've measured, and it's not even a variable. It's treated as a constant, right? That for everybody knows that the Republican leadership is skeptical and the Democratic leadership is not. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. I'll be right back. So, let's see. Okay. So, that's one challenge, is the fact that variable is a constant. And so therefore, you're not actually able to test an interaction explicitly, quantitatively. And so all you can do is you can just look at half of it. So you have to kind of ease people into that, where you could say, well, in the end of the intro, you could say, well, the ideal way you might imagine to test this theory would be to treat the positions of the exemplars and spokespeople as a variable and look for that interaction. But in the real world, group by group, you could certainly imagine that the positions of those people are variables as opposed to constants. But if they are, more likely, kind of everybody gets it. And the minute you start treating them as variables, all of a sudden they become perceptions caught up in the same kind of loop, I'll call it, as we have now. In other words, you could imagine if you started asking people, what do you think the leadership of the Republican Party thinks, that there would be projection onto that. And now it's no longer an independent variable, it's a dependent variable. You see what I mean?
So some of the same processes that we're saying apply when you're calculating the beliefs of the party as a whole would also factor in there.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
and so this is not a new problem. This is present in the literature on perceptions of political candidates. So in trying to understand how perceived issue positions influence votes by in ordinary elections for U.S. president, whatever, one of the perspectives is that people use the issue positions of the candidates, and so if you want to take abortion, does abortion shape people's voting behavior? Well, you would want to measure where respondents think Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump stand on abortion, and then you would measure where the respondents stand on abortion, and you could compute a distance score, and you could go down the pathway. And the problem is that in a situation like that you have the potential for the candidate's own position to be the perceptions of the candidate's own position to be the result of projection partly, and now it causes a mess in terms of the estimation. So the good news is that what scholars have, become comfortable with in that arena, which will then help you justify what you're doing, is to use you treat it as a constant. And in that literature, there's a particularly famous paper, Gelman and King. No, sorry, Gelman and Jeff Lewis is one of the two. It might be Lewis and King, might be King and Lewis. Anyway, what they argue, I mean, you can find that, and they're talking about a competition between directional and proximity voting, I think, are the terms that they use for these two theories. Do you remember hearing me, Bo, anybody discuss that distinction at all?
I don't.
Okay, so basically, you don't need to know, but it's just there are two different theories of how an individual might use a candidate's position on an issue to make a decision about how to evaluate the candidate. And so it turns out that in that arena, that whether you treat the candidate's position as a variable or a constant has tremendous impact on if you treat it as a variable, one of the two competing models wins. If you treat it as a constant, the other model wins. And so, that's not a happy situation where a foundational assumption completely determines the outcome of some, theory contest. So the only reason I'm bringing that up is because that we could cite that literature, not the Gary King paper in particular, but the literature that is cited and addressed in that paper, wherein a bunch of people became comfortable using the candidate's average position, treating the candidate's position as a constant. I think that's an option. Okay, so having said that, you have to kind of ease your reader into being comfortable with the idea that this variable is not a variable. That the position on the issue held by the leaders, the spokespeople / exemplars is not a variable, but nonetheless you can look for this interaction, because what you're going to do is you're going to make the assumption of the constant, and then you're going to divide up the respondents into the people who are deviants and the people who are not, and then you're going to look at the coefficient on own position in predicting perceptions of the group. So I felt like that logic, it might help you for me to articulate that logic, just to see whether you say, yep, I got that, and I kind of didn't have it in the paper all that clearly before, and it's getting clearer now in my thinking, and I can see how we could put it in, whatever. So let me stop there for a second. Am I helping?
Yeah. No.
Oh, now I am losing half of what you said.
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah, that's super helpful, and I think there's kind of like a couple things that I was noting down. So one that I think we could spend a little bit more time talking about, what kinds of groups are relevant to this.
Yes.
Being a bit clearer about that, and then I think thinking about it as like how the person thinks about their self as a data point.
Yeah.
Super useful, and I think we could tweak what we've written in the intro to reflect that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so then I guess one of the things that Adina and I were trying to do after our last conversation was just look at because we started thinking okay, is there something that we can get from the actual output of the model if we look at those kind of coefficients of own opinion, and we were struggling with that a little bit to figure out okay, is our data kind of in line with one of these stories?
Yeah.
So you have thoughts related to that, kind of building on your last point, that would be super helpful too.
We are going to get exactly to that question because I have that question for you too.
Perfect. Awesome. Great.
Yeah. So okay. So we've got. So I just basically what I wanted to suggest is that every paper's introduction is kind of like a Rubik's Cube. That that you want to have these ideas in here, and you want to have those ideas in here, and so on. The question is, in what order to put them so that they progress cumulatively to tell the story that you want to tell. And what I'm feeling like can be in here, and it quite kind of isn't in here yet, is a section that maybe isn't explicitly called a theory of group perceptions, but it could be called a theory of group perceptions, where you kind of lay this logic out step by step. You say, okay, there's some groups, and I'm not saying literally, definitely I don't mean literally, but there's some groups that you could be asked about, like the owners of pizza restaurants where people might think like this, but then there are other groups that have exemplars and spokespeople, and in those situations, the perceivers might think in the following way. And one possibility, once you have that, is an additive equation. Another possibility is a multiplicative situation. And just going step by step through the logic of it all. That in and of itself is going to excite readers in psychology. And it's the kind of thing that you personally, career-wise, it's like, wow, people are going to say, that was great. This paper is really impressive. And that one of the ways that you can kind of know whether you're on the right wavelength is that where your review of past studies goes in the flow of the intro once you really get it humming. So, for example, right now in the introduction, there's a couple paragraphs that sort of describe the 2 or 3 papers that have looked at perceptions of climate change opinions. And it's almost like it's very early in the introduction, and let's just get this out of the way, and we'll just tell you, these are the 3 papers. This is what they did. There's really not much here, and so we're going to address this better. And that sort of fits with the language that's in a number of places, including I think there, where maybe you say 3 times in the intro something like, but nothing is known about this, or evidence is mixed on this, and those phrases are very tempting to use in papers, and people certainly do use them in papers, but I actually think they almost always they're not helpful. That there's tons that we don't know about and so not knowing about it isn't a reason to publish a paper on it. And so usually, that to me is a sign of not the strongest argument, most compelling argument, to get people to be excited about a paper. Whereas if you go the path that I'm talking about now, where you actually have this a kind of a theory. Well, sorry, let's be clear. What I'm saying, there's 2 kinds of literature that is sort of the past that you are needing to acknowledge in the paper. One is the broader literatures on perceptions of attitudes generally, and with false consensus, blah, blah, blah. That's all huge. And that kind of stuff, that literature, you do want to get out early in the paper and sort of say, here's the short version of the history of research on perceptions of group opinions, and you've got that, of course. But in this paper, we want to introduce a new perspective on types of groups that have not, been considered. And here, notice the distinction here. I just told you I didn't think it was very helpful to say not much is known about something. That's different from this hasn't been considered before. We're proposing a new idea. And so that's where you say, oh, it's a new theory. Okay, cool. Let's find out about that. So, here, this is what we're going to propose to add on. We're going to add on this idea of group spokespeople and exemplars. And now we're going to give you the theory of how for some groups they don't exist, they're not relevant, but for other groups they do exist and they are relevant. And then only eventually when you say, we're going to now test this theory in the context of climate change, and the readers of this journal, the reviewers of the journal say, oh, cool, now I see. Because they're psychologists, they understand that building psychological theory then leads to the testing of the theory in a particular context. And so you say, okay, we're going to do that here. And then let us tell you, there are 3 studies that have explored perceptions of public opinion on climate change before. And here's what they found. None of them address our theory. And so that's why we're collecting new data. So in other words, it's absolutely true that they didn't think of your theory. They didn't think of differentiating people into people who are misaligned and those who are not. And so you just say, they did this, this, and this, but none of that tests this theory. And so, great. Then you say, okay, good, moving forward. So let me stop for a second. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That right now we just kind of lay out as like, here are the relevant studies that have looked at perceptions of public opinion on climate change at all, rather than using them to make some kind of point related to
exactly
theory that we're building. Yeah,
exactly.
So just figuring out a way to weave them into the extent that they're useful.
Yeah, you put that perfectly. Yeah. So it's really always having in mind every paragraph you write in an introduction, always having in mind, why is this here? How is this fitting into the flow? Am I just, knocking off an obligation that I have to write about past literature, or is this in the right place to be, maximally helpful? And so, in the flow of the argument that I want to make. So that's that's that logic that I wanted to just start off by talking about. And then I felt like when I looked through the introduction, sort of standing back, squinting at it, looking at the section headings to say, can I find the theory here? Can I read those 2 pages or 2.5 pages that lay out the theory clearly and so on? I wasn't sure. It felt like it's not like the introduction's badly written. It's not like the introduction is irrelevant. That absolutely not. But it's more like, is it really tight? Is it really flowing and spotlighting? And all of these themes that we've talked about are definitely here. But sort of when we get to page 8 and there's a section number 2 called background, that's where we were talking about this being somehow disrupted. Like you were introducing the ideas before, and then the new theoretical ideas before. Then we've got this interruption of a little bit of past research. Then we have now the theory that begins in section 2.2 on page 9, and so it's really partly a little bit of, again, this Rubik's Cube of just reorganizing the flow. But let me also just ask that I think in terms of the argument that examples are really helpful. So for example, on page 10, you mentioned Barack Obama and the Democratic Party platform and the Republican platform. And maybe it's just due to what's happening in the news lately, but the first thing that came to mind is John McCain. And so, John McCain was the Republican Party's nominee for president and in 2008. And he and Obama agreed on climate change. And so it might make some sense in writing the theory and even, talking about these examples to think about the idea that actually over time, the exemplars and leaders of a group might change, and that McCain was a really powerful spokesperson and exemplar when he was the party's nominee. Beforehand, he was a kind of outlying maverick of the Republican Party. And once he lost, you might argue that actually his positions became kind of rejected by the party. And that, he tried and failed. And so therefore the party, might have become even more solidly opposed to those positions. And just so, because otherwise I'm afraid that the theory comes off as a little naive if it doesn't acknowledge things like that, where
the possibility for change over time,
exactly,
or the flexibility of the position of exemplars.
exactly,
We could kind of use the section to say, like, okay, well, if you look out at if we're like defining this constant, looking out at like the information that's available, like most of it supports this idea, but of course there's instances where it might conflict, or where over time this might become more or less endorsed by exemplars.
Yeah. Like, so for example, do you, if I say the Fenton ad, do you know what I'm talking about? Have we discussed this before? FENTON?
Yeah, this is the group of, like, they were creating ads related to climate change and were they having prominent leaders speak about it? And in general, like, it seemed to work. The people were actually persuaded by the Fenton ads. Yeah,
so that it's just one ad, and it's just a bunch of clips of prominent Republicans: George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, other people back, boom, boom, boom. Little video clips of these guys saying climate change exists and it's a threat and we need to do something about it. And so you might argue, what's going on there? Well, one of the predictions that your theory would make is that if these are spokespeople and exemplars, and you show a lot of them expressing this particular position, that this is both unexpected maybe in the current environment, that people have forgotten, that actually Richard Nixon presided over the creation of the EPA. And Earth Day in 1970 was I think that's when it was created. And it was, that Republicans were perceived to be stewards of the natural resources of the planet at the time. And so I think you'll come off as more sophisticated to your readers if the theory presentation acknowledges that there can be shifts over time, and also, that some people, that it's like you and I know what the Republican Party's position on climate change is and what the Democratic Party's position. Although even when I hear myself say that, I'm thinking, what did I just say? Like, what does that even mean? Who is the Democratic Party? But it's sort of like we have a feeling that liberals think this and conservatives think that on this issue. But there are got to be lots of Americans who would be in a representative sample survey who just don't pay attention to politics the way we do. They just literally, they would go to the sports section of the newspaper, period. And for them, they don't know. And so anyway, just acknowledging that there may be heterogeneity among people. So these are all the kinds of ideas that one would normally want to have in a theory section, and that a lot of them are in the intro, which is great. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the way I'm describing it, where you sort of say what you say at the very, very beginning, here's the background on research on perceptions of group opinions generally. We're going to introduce a new theory. To begin with, we're going to begin by introducing the idea that some groups have spokespeople and exemplars and some don't. Secondly, that lay people may have lay theories about the opinions, the relationship of the opinions of exemplars and leaders, spokespeople, and the positions of the rank and file. So there may be no reason for perceivers to believe that the president of the National Hockey League has anything to reveal about the opinions of the hockey league professional players and their position on abortion. But there are some issues and some types of groups where the exemplars and the spokespeople probably do have informational value because of this two-directional process of influence we talked about earlier. That is that those exemplars and spokespeople might persuade the rank and file, but also the rank and file might choose the exemplars and the spokespeople. Either way, that'll create that link. And so then with that in mind, having established that there are, different kinds of groups and different kinds of issues, that on an issue where the necessary conditions are met, that there are exemplars and spokespeople, that there is a logical constraint between their positions and the positions of the rank and file. Now, on that basis, it may not be surprising that perceivers would use the positions of those folks. And so here's an additive equation whereby they might incorporate those, but then here's the interactive equation as well. So I'm just trying to say this again and again just to see if it's helpfully clear in terms of the flow that you might want to consider for the intro.
Yeah, no, that definitely, that makes a lot of sense as the different pieces, and I can definitely see how they're like kind of in there, but not organized or fully kind of developed. So I think we can do some work to reorganize things accordingly. And then I was thinking too, like, if we spend more time justifying like why we're treating the opinions of the spokespeople as a constant, then I think that also like changes how we can write about it in the discussion, where rather than saying like, oh, this is something that we didn't measure and future studies could measure it, to say, in the study we chose to treat the opinions of spokespeople as a constant, but future studies could kind of measure people's awareness to see like, is this something that people differ on? Kind of like as you were just saying earlier, that some people might be more or less aware of these cues, to like maybe something that future research could try to suss out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Now, let me just interrupt for a second, just to say that at 7:45 in 4 minutes is when I would normally expect to hear from John Protzko. Do you remember who he is?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a postdoc from Santa Barbara who gave a couple presentations.
Yeah. So that's our usual meeting time. However, he just had a baby last week. And he's kind of been on like parental leave a little bit the last couple weeks. So I'm thinking that he is not going to need to talk to me. So if you want to continue, we can continue, because I definitely have more to say.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then if he calls in, I'm happy to either set up another time or.
Well, I think I can just talk with him briefly. In fact, maybe what I could do, just because we're at a little bit of a breaking point, is just ask you to hang on a second. Let me call him. And let me just ask him if he wants to, if there's anything quick to talk about, or, because he really kind of hasn't done anything since we last talked. So, so why don't I do that? Bring back on. Okay, I think we've kind of wrapped up that discussion, so I can now turn us to a different topic.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So, it's my wife calling on the other line. Let me just take her call just a sec. I'll be right back. So I just want to make a little comment, just a little side comment at the moment, which is that, you and I have now written a number of papers together, and you kind of know how the process goes. And the one of the things that you might find puzzling, or any collaborator might find puzzling or slightly annoying, is that my reactions to manuscripts are at two different levels. They're like the big conceptual level, like we've just been talking about, and then they're at a really micro level about like punctuation and to verb tense and stuff like that. Like really like seemingly really trivial stuff. And you and I may have had this conversation before, but I just wanted you to know that, in case I haven't said this clearly, that there are two reasons why I bring up those kind of writing details. The most important one is that I often get tripped up as a reader trying to work my way through a manuscript if even really simple stuff is not right. So in other words, there's one of the things you'll see in the notes that I wrote in the paper has to do with verb tense, that sometimes the stuff moves back and forth between present tense and past tense. And I'm not just raising that just to be annoying. I'm raising it because for me, when I start reading the wrong tense, I literally have to like put the brakes on of my reading, stop for a minute, think, wait, are we talking about the present or the past? Okay, I got it now. And so it's just, I'm trying to make sure that at least for me, I actually can read it smoothly and understand the argument, and even these sort of seemingly trivial things are help me and probably help other readers. So I just want to apologize for what might seem like really micro niggling kinds of things, but there it is stuff that's relevant. And of course, then this, as you may have heard me say before, that also relevant is the fact that when I've just seen so many reviews where over the decades where reviewers say, wow, there's just a lot of typos in this paper. I don't know if I have confidence in that these authors were careful with their data analysis either. And so we just don't want to send that signal. So that's why I've taken time to highlight these things. So thank you for letting me say that.
That makes sense. Yeah, especially like with the results section, sometimes wandering between tenses happens a lot with a particular section.
Yeah, exactly.
Particularly problematic. That'd be great to know.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the things that confused me is, actually, sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier, and I want to just bring this up. That the whole framing of the paper that we've been discussing so far works really, really well in and of itself, I think, where we're saying, kind of this is the history of group perception research. This is the new idea that's going to be introduced here is, two new ideas. Number one, spokespeople and exemplars and differentiating different types of groups, then differentiating issues that are either relevant to or not relevant to, or, not informed by or not informed by the spokespeople and exemplars. And then we're going to go a step further and introduce this idea of opinion deviance. And these are all the new moving parts in the theory here. And that's the kind of framing where people are going to, by the time they're through the intro, they're going to really clearly see what's new, and they're going to see why it's interesting and big think and promising. So, having said that, there's one other theme that, as you will remember, I have always loved of relevance to this work, and really, in a way, it's what started the work, which was trying to explain why on this particular issue, on the climate change issue, Americans are systematically inaccurate on average in their perceptions. And so I bring this up because I continue to think, at least for me personally, that it's another, like I didn't know why people, what could explain why people are underestimating the size of the group in the public that believes in the existence and threat of climate change. And I feel like you guys did the perfect thing to address that problem, which was to go back to ground zero, build a theory of perceptions of groups, articulate that theory, test the theory, and that there's just one more step that is kind of omitted from the paper, which to me has the potential to be a really great, kind of like dollop of whipped cream on top of the sundae, which is to say, okay, now that we've laid out the theory, does this theory help explain, partly or completely, why it is that Americans underestimate the proportion of Americans who believe in the existence and threat of climate change, or I guess it's only existence in this paper, and in particular that the underestimation is greatest with regard to the to Republicans. And so, I mean, actually, is that true?
Yeah, I think it happens for both groups, but particularly for the Republicans too. So people believe that a minority of Republicans actually believe in global warming. So it's kind of like I think the majority-minority aspect of it is interesting.
Right. Yeah. That's a very important political line. And I definitely remember that like it's 55% actually believe it, and and Americans think on average it's 30 or 35% of Republicans believe it. But so let's just say that's a 20 percentage point error. I'm just not remembering I think it might be that the error for perceptions of Democrats is as big. So maybe 95% of Democrats think it's happening, and people perceive it to be 75. So then it would be, an equal error on average for both groups. So that's not critical. But the whole point is, to sort of say, okay, if the process of group perceptions on this issue goes the way our regressions indicate it does, then can we use the logic of our theory to explain why it is that these estimations are off, why they're too low? And I think the answer has to be to work through a discussion of what percent of Democrats are opinion deviant, what percent of Republicans are opinion deviant, and kind of do what I would call a simulation, where you say, these processes are going to pull the numbers down. And I know that I don't know that if I probably was only emailing with Adina about this at one time, but she and I were definitely in an email conversation about exactly this. And so I'm assuming you have not seen David Yeager's paper that's probably going to go to PPS like tomorrow, writing up his college sophomores comparison. If I say, is that enough for you to know the project I'm talking about, or should I remind you?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so David has for years been working on this paper with me, where we replicated a series of classic social psychological effects with representative samples. And what we found was the effect sizes were almost everything replicated. Norbert Schwartz's ease of retrieval study did not replicate. The rest of them replicated, but the effect sizes are all weaker in the general American public than they are in college students in the literature, if you look at meta-analyses of past published studies. And what David did was, after he got these interactions in a regression, he did a simulation where he said, okay, using only the national survey data, if we want to assess what the effect sizes would be among people with the characteristics of college students, what do we get? And so that he kind of ends the paper with this graph that has it's a bar graph that has 4 bars in it. And that's the explosive punchline of the paper. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk over to my computer right now, and I'm going to send the latest draft to you. And then you could just see how that happens at the end. And I think if this paper, I definitely don't. I know you guys are excited about getting this paper done and out, and you're happy with it. And I don't mean for any of the conversation we're having today to knock you off balance. It's really just me telling you honestly what I'm excited about in the paper, and opportunities that I can see for revision if you want to do them. And this is just another if you want to do it kind of thing, where if you want to read this, then you can. You are okay. There you are. Let me just remove that. Okay, so you can read that, and then you can see. If you don't want to bother, no problem. If you want to do it, that's great too. It's totally up to you. So does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're thinking we could do something similar insofar as, here's, given that this percentage of Republicans are opinion deviant, here's how that would, kind of feed back into explaining the misperception. And then the example in Dave's paper is kind of like with how to do that. And so he actually ran, a simulation related to that? Or?
Yeah. It's not literally the same. I just wanted you to see what a simulation could look like at the end of a results section that's kind of like this. There's another paper, too, that we did years ago on news media priming that also kind of ends with a little simulation-y kind of thing. But I think this will be sufficient for now to look at. But so the idea would be to... So let me just say very quickly what I perceive to be the potentially useful little hook here, which is that let's say that the truth is that Democrats are overwhelmingly green on climate, let's say 95%, which I think might be true. And let's say that they are especially that they are inclined to do oppositional projection with when they're asked about Republicans. And so they are shoving Republicans way down. So they're estimating Republicans, I'm just making this up, to be 10% thinking that climate change is happening. And so that alone, if there are a lot of those Democrats and they're pushing them down, then and what I mean by that is, if the interactive model is correct, in other words, if the Democrats say, man, these, there's so many, I can name a whole list of Republicans who have expressed skeptical views on climate. These people drive me crazy, and that the Democrats don't use their own position at all, this is the interactive model, that they don't use their green position to assimilate Republicans upwards. They're only doing this enthusiastic oppositional projection. So the Democrats are estimating, near zero Republicans believe it. Furthermore, that one of the things that the paper doesn't really do yet, which we haven't talked about, is the independents. It sort of sidesteps the independents. But you could easily imagine that if independents say, I am not a Republican and I am not a Democrat, but I am green. Most independents are green, right? And so if they do oppositional projection to the Democrats and the Republicans, and there are like 50% of the country is independent, then the fact that they are majority green is going to push their perceptions of Republicans and Democrats down. So you can see I'm starting to highlight a series of different perceiver situations, all of which will lead to underestimation of the percent of people who are green, and no positive projection, only oppositional projection, and that if you say there's a whole bunch of those scenarios and almost no scenarios whereby that people are going to be doing this kind of in-group projection. That could explain it. Am I not making complete sense?
No, I think it makes sense in that when it comes to I could either another section of the paper, at least in the discussion section, kind of building out why the failure to project your own belief or the attention to the signals from the spokespeople would then ultimately feed back into this underestimation.
Yeah.
So at least talking through what that looks like for Democrats and Republicans. For independents, I think one of the reasons why Adina and I left them out is we just weren't sure that with independents it would necessarily meet the conditions for oppositional projection. I think with Democrats and Republicans, we thought those are two groups where it probably would make sense for that to happen. With independents, we were just a little bit less sure what that would look like, whether they would show that same kind of tendency to want to differentiate themselves from the other two groups.
Yeah.
Or whether that might not be present. So I don't know if we could spend some more time, maybe in the paper, justifying why we chose to just look at the Democrats and Republicans as far as partisans go.
No, well, I think it's fine to do what you did with only the Democrats and Republicans, although I will tell you, it took me a while to realize that in Table 1 that the multiplicative model is different people than the first. The first column is 802 respondents, the second column is 429 respondents. I didn't see that for a long time, and I just didn't. It took me a long time to realize what was going on there, and that you were focusing in the second column only on Democrats and Republicans, and that are perceivers, which is totally fine. I think it's fine to test the model that way. But what you might want to consider doing is just having an additional analysis, which is easy enough, with just the independents, and say, okay, well, when the independents are asked to perceive the Democrats, what's the coefficient of own position predicting perception of group? And among the independents, what's the coefficient of own position predicting the other, what I forgot what I said, but perceptions of Republicans, perceptions of Democrats, and the reason I raise this is because presumably, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that independents don't have exemplars and spokespeople. And so that group is kind of unconstrained by that element of your theory. And so therefore there aren't going to be any opinion deviants. There aren't going to be any people who therefore need to suppress the impact of their own position on perceptions of the groups. And so all I'm doing is proposing here that among the independents, if you do the basic analysis of just saying, like column 1 of table 1, to what degree does own position predict perceptions of the group, that's going to be the traditional false consensus effect. There's going to be, because by definition, there are no spokespeople or exemplars. And so there can't be any deviance, and therefore we'll see the normal false consensus effect. And if you get that, that's actually a nice confirmation of the theory, furthermore. And then because of that, then the whole point here is to say, okay, well, but that we didn't ask people, referring to Americans as a whole, but we didn't ask the survey respondents about their perceptions of independence. And so we can't only look at independents' perceptions of independence, but we can explore the possibility that even if independents' own position predicts perceptions of the country as a whole positively, it's in theory possible and in practice possible that own position predicts the perceived positions of Republicans and Democrats by independents negatively. So in other words, we could in theory see oppositional projection when the independents are asked about Democrats and when the independents are asked about Republicans. And if those coefficients are negative, that would be consistent with the idea that there is this oppositional projection going on in both cases. I am not a Democrat and I am not a Republican. And that, just as a little footnote, there, you may know there is a literature in political science that is a little bit skeptical about independence because that there, I think you heard Sam Sklar talk about it a couple of years ago, or more than a couple of years ago in PPRG, that there are these kind of closet partisans, so people who say they're independents, but then when you ask them, do you lean one way or another, they lean toward the Republicans or they lean toward the Democrats. I think we might have the leaning question in our survey, and so you could, in theory, do the analysis separately for the leaners and the not leaners, just to protect yourself against being fooled there. But anyway, that strikes me both as a nice additional element of testing this theory, to have a little section at the end of the results to say, okay, now we're going to just look at the perceptions held by independents. But then that sets the stage for what I'm considering this possible final section of the results, which would be the simulation, to say, okay, now that we know what's going on here, and now that we know that the independents are overwhelmingly green and the Democrats are overwhelmingly green, and we've already seen that there's a decent amount of oppositional projection going on, that in a really crude sense, if you say the majority of the huge majority of Americans are green on the issue, lots of them are doing oppositional projection, that's all you need to know. That in and of itself is going to push down perceptions of the country as a whole and perceptions of all these other groups. And then we can actually show you step by step, this is how many Republicans, Democrats, and independents there are in the country. This is how many of each group is opinion deviant, and and kind of add it up. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think those kinds of numbers are in the paper right now, are they?
So for the kinds of numbers you mean, like the percentage of...
Not just the percentage of the country that in these data are Republicans and Democrats and independents, but the percent of each of those groups that is opinion deviant and the percent that isn't opinion deviant.
Oh, yes, I think we added that in for Democrats and Republicans, but we definitely haven't looked at independents. But for, Democrats and Republicans...
Okay, well, we're saying that it's not, by definition, that independents can't be opinion deviant, so that's okay. But let's see, where is this?
Let me check. Oh, yeah, so it's in section 5.3, moderation by opinion deviance.
Yeah.
I believe the bottom of page 19.
Yeah, I got it. So, 29% were deviant, 14% Democrats, 57%. Ah, okay.
Yeah, we use the numbers that were calculated with sample weights in producing that.
Yeah. The whole thing should be weighted as you said, so that's fine. Okay. Well, somehow I think I just saw that in passing there and forgot about it, but that could be input to the. I mean, that's pretty interesting, right? That only 14% are deviant, whereas among Democrats, but 57% of Republicans are. Makes sense, of course. So anyhow, all right, let me stop talking about that theme. And then, okay, I'm just going to say this really quickly. The paper, I think, might usually say percentage, like the percentage of Americans who think this. I'm pretty sure that there's a technical distinction between the word percent and percentage, and it may be that this is the right use of percentage, but I got this little feeling like maybe it should be percent. So it would be good to, if you don't know it, just look that up and just be sure.
Just make sure we're consistent throughout with whatever.
Well, there's a distinction between the two. That you're supposed to, one means one thing and the other one means something else, and so use the right one consistently is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'll double check on that.
Okay, and another little tiny thing. So when I send you if you want me to send you the scan of the handwritten comments that I put here, one of the things you'll see is that one of the terms that again kind of caught me up in various places is, for example, pro-climate opinions. Like then we don't really mean pro-climate. I mean, it's not like these people are somehow in favor of the climate. It's that they're what I call green on the issue, and it's fine for you to have some other term, but somehow like pro-climate or believing in climate change, that maybe not quite the best ones.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, maybe like green or just choosing something.
Yeah. Yep.
So are you thinking of it like saying like belief or like I guess it just feels unwieldy to say like those who believe in climate change. We could certainly say that.
You could say the believe in the existence of climate change, or that's just a lot of words, and so you can figure that out. But just somehow, I know it was like a abbreviation strategy that seemed like maybe like pro climate opinion. That just doesn't say really what you want to say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so there's like lots of notes here. So the last thing is that I felt like in the results. Sorry, I'm going to say one other tiny thing, which is there are some places that I've noted, and there may be other places as well, where like in table 1 in the first column, the labels are really good at making it clear that when you say Democrat or Republican, you've made it clear whether you mean the respondent is a Democrat or Republican or the target is a Democrat or Republican. That's great. But then there are other places in the paper, just not a lot, but a few that I noticed, and there might be more that I didn't notice, that where it doesn't. It just says Democrats. And so I think you kind of always need to help readers not get confused by labeling that distinction a little bit more clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The target versus respondent issue.
Okay, so now the most important thing that I wanted to raise about the results is that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that let's look at table 1 together.
Mm-hmm.
Let me know when you're there.
I'm there.
Okay. So again, you've heard me say this before, that whenever you have an opportunity to order anything, it's an opportunity to help tell the story in the way that you want to tell it and to control the attention of the readers. So those first 2 rows of table 1, the respondent Democrat and respondent Republican, the coefficients are non-significant. They're not interesting. You don't really have any theories about them. So I've written here in my comments to propose that the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rows move up to be the first rows. And if that's true, then the first row people are going to see is that 6.71 and the 11.77. And sorry, what that says is that in the additive model column, that first 6.71, that is false consensus. And then the 7.40 below it, and then minus 10.41 below that, those are kind of like, main effects or adjustments to suggest that people are not only projecting their own opinions, as shown by the 6.71, but they're also using something, expectations about the group, stereotypes about the group, exemplars and spokespeople about the group, to make adjustments on top of own opinion for Democrats and Republicans. That's great. So that first column makes perfect sense. And now you're going to go the next step, and you're going to say, okay, what about opinion deviance? And the key place to look is those two last rows before the horizontal line, which is, gigantic three-way interactions. Okay, that's great. So, there's really, it's too difficult to interpret those three-way interactions just using the coefficients in the second column of table 1. So now we're going to go to table 2, and we're going to break all this down. And the place that we want people to look, I think, is it the first row only? Really, everything else is irrelevant, or is it the 1, 2, 3, the fourth and fifth rows that we want people to look?
I think the first 3 rows that are probably the most critical, and that those are kind of revealing, like, among these groups, is false consensus happening? Are they paying attention to the cues, whether it's the expectations or the spokespeople, which I think the first and then second and third row help us to get at.
Okay, so the column headings where it says Republicans and Democrats in bold there, that's the perceiver?
So that's the perceiver.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. All right. So let's look at the first column. So among Republicans.
And these are Republicans who believe in global warming.
Well, they wouldn't be...
Republicans who do not believe in global warming. Sorry, the aligned ones.
Right. So the Republicans who do not believe, those are the aligned ones. So the fact that they have 5.18 means that, in that first row, means that there is no false consensus, no projection of self onto the group, when the group is what? It's not Democrats and not Republicans. Is it independents? Is that... are the independents back in this analysis?
So this is without independents. It's just the Democrats and Republicans. So this would be, I believe, when the target is the nation, the general Americans.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, because the second and third rows are the dummies identifying the target, Democrat and Republican, the omitted target is nation as a whole. And so what that 5.18 means is that when perceiving the nation as a whole, meaning the Democrat and Republican dummies in the second and third rows are 0, that there's no main effect, but that Republicans do not project themselves onto independents, I think is what that means.
Yeah, because it's accounting for the other targets.
Yeah. And so that's pretty interesting, right? That the Republicans don't project themselves. But then when we go to the next column, so here are Democrats who do believe in climate change. They are aligned. But they have this strong negative coefficient. So when they're perceiving the country as a whole, it looks like they are doing oppositional projection, right? That's kind of weird. See what I mean? That minus 11.87?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if, because I know like with this, the purpose of this table, so I'm wondering if it's really like the second and third rows that are the ones that we we definitely had changed the way that we coded global warming existence belief, which I think is because those effects flip if you look at like columns 3 and 4 where it's just the same coefficient but in the opposite direction, because we then had recoded global warming existence belief.
Yeah.
So I think insofar as like looking at the effects among the aligned versus opinion deviant respondents. Maybe it's only 2 and 3 that are really like what's happening among those groups, and the global warming has just been coded differently to get at those groups.
Okay. So, well, let's actually just pause for a quick second. Let's look at the top row of the table. Look across the row. 5.18, 11.87, 5.18, 11.87. Right? Those are mirror images of each other.
Yeah.
And then if you go to the next row, 16.91, 11.16, 1.59, 1.07. So then they're not, the third and fourth columns are not the mirror image of the first and second columns. On the next row, again, they're not mirror images, and then they go back to being mirror images, and then they go back to being mirror images. So that I haven't yet done the math to think that through. That might be correct, but I'm a little suspicious there. So I'm not completely sure. Also, are the numbers in table 2? Are they derived from the coefficients in table 1, or are they actually from a series of 4 separate regressions?
Yeah, so they're from a series of, it should be 2 separate regressions. Or rather than separate regressions, I guess it's all a regression that was conducted with all of the Democrat and Republican respondents. But what's changed between columns 1 and 2 and then columns 3 and 4 is just how global warming existence belief was coded.
Well, it's it's that plus the opinion deviants are on the right and the aligned respondents are on the left, right?
Yeah, but the way that we looked at the effects among the opinion deviant respondents was by recoding that global warming existence belief, because we coded it as like the omitted base group was that you think that global warming has been happening. Then the coefficient target Democrat and target Republican would help us to figure out among the Democratic respondents whether they were doing oppositional or in-group projection. For the aligned ones, if it's for Democrats where the global warming existence belief that's been happening is coded as like 0 is that you believe that it's been happening.
Hold on, let me try to digest this just a second. Okay, I have to apologize to you. I've spent a lot of time staring at these tables, trying to figure out what was done in them, and I haven't yet got my head wrapped around it. And this would be an example of where I'm thrown off, because the way I read the headings, when it says aligned respondents on the left and opinion deviant respondents on the right, that leads my brain to think this is one subset of people on the left side and a different subset of people on the right side. And what you're saying is, no, it's all the same people, and almost all the variables are coded the same. It's just that the first variable on the first row of the table is coded differently. And then I'm seeing, okay, that it's columns 1 and 4 are coded that way. Yeah, I can't seem to wrap my head around how to interpret this and how this is capturing.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if actually if having it in table format is useful, or if it's more useful to say in the text what was done, where what we wanted to do was to code the variables such that we could look at the kind of simple effects of target within each of these groups to see whether there's in-group and out-group projection happening.
Right.
So essentially the only kind of relevant coefficients for that are the target Democrat, target Republican. Maybe we could just write those in the text rather than putting them in the table, since otherwise it is just it's a mirror image because we recoded.
Yeah. So okay. So let's say the following, that there are basically 2 ways that you could help readers understand the multiplicative model on the right side of table 1. One way is that you could do a series of regressions for different subgroups of people. So like if what we care about here is these three-way interactions in table 1, respondent, Republican times GW times target Democrat or Republican, the minus 25.23 and the plus 20.73. Then one thing you could do is just take these coefficients, and knowing the coding, you don't have to do any more regressions. You can just do a little algebra to say the effect of respondent's own position, that is the effect of GW, on perceptions of Democrats by opinion deviance is this, perceptions of Democrats by opinion non-deviance is this, perceptions of Republicans among opinion deviance is this, perception of Republicans among non-opinion deviance is this. Oh, shoot. 1 second. Matt Barron is calling for our next call. Hey, Matt.
Hey, John.
Can I call you right back? I'm just finishing with Lauren.
Sure.
Okay, I'll call you right back.
Bye.
Okay, so you can do it by algebra, but you could also, Lauren, you could subset the sample, and you could say, okay, here's this regression in this group, and this regression in this group, and so on. Now, there's a literature that said subsetting is a bad idea. That what you should do, I mean, you could do it, and I've done it before, and it's not completely insane, but there are advocates of the idea that really, if you want to get it right, use the coefficients in the right column of table 1 and do the algebra to figure out what the coefficients of interest to you are in each subgroup according to that model. And then, it may be that you want to present that in a graph. You'll see that my notes here basically said that I wasn't sure that figure 1 really, or figure 2 really helps you. I was having trouble. I mean, they're not completely labeled in a transparent way, but I just I wasn't sure that showing those in graphs really helps tell a powerful story. But it might be that graphing these predicted coefficients from the right-hand column of table 1 would be a really powerful way to go, because there, instead of like saying in table 1 there are no differences, which is not very interesting to present in a picture, here you would have differences, and so you could present that way. So okay, so since we are out of time, let me propose the following. How about if I scan and I send you what I have, what I've written on this draft, which is a mixture of all different kinds of comments. We've obviously gone through lots of different types of issues in this conversation, and I don't know how you guys want to handle it, but I don't want to overwhelm you. I want to help you in the way that you want me to help you, and so if you feel like getting a scan of these chicken scratch comments is helpful, we can do that. Otherwise, I could just send you this recording, or if you think even the recording is not a good idea, I don't have to send you that. It's whatever you want.
Yeah, I think it would be super helpful to have the recording, and then I think it'd be useful to have the comments as well. Obviously, we'll make a lot of changes based on this conversation, but I think it could be nice in after we make the kind of substantive changes to go back and see are some of the chicken scratch comments, are they things that we also should just quickly address?
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, they might still be relevant in a revised draft.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So can I just get a little feedback here? Do you feel like this conversation is helpful? Is it wasting time on the wrong things? Is it annoying? Is it in the right direction?
I feel like it's been super helpful, especially the comments about the kind of substantive concerns and getting the story in the intro right. That I think was a very valuable part of the discussion.
Okay. Any other feedback or thoughts?
Yeah, nothing that comes to mind right now. I think I'm feeling more and more confident about what kind of story we could tell that would make sense.
Great.
And I think as far as the analyses, I'll definitely have to defer to Adina a little bit on that, since she's kind of more on the ground as far as actually conducting them.
Got it. Yeah, you guys have divided up the labor a little bit. I got it. Okay. All right. Well, just feel free to continue to let me know how I can help you the most, and definitely don't lose track of the fact that I'm really excited about this paper. That I think it's just taking a little bit of time to explain the new ideas, and there are like lots of really simple papers. You do a little experiment, you manipulate the order of the answer choices, you show that it has statistically significant effects, and that's the end of it. This is much more conceptually innovative and analytically unconventional, and so that's why it's taking I think the work to get the paper just right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for all the feedback and taking so much time to chat with me this morning. I hope you feel better.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording.